Kevin, it's great to have you on Beginner's Mind. Tell me a little bit about what you've been up to. I know you've been learning Spanish and taking some classes. Tell me a little bit about what you've been doing.
Okay, I always tell my students, or I always told my students at Vandercook that if I could do it all over again, that I would have a teacher all the time because the teacher is able to take you to places you wouldn't normally go, and they also are able to take you there faster than you could ever do yourself. So when I retired, my wife and I started taking a Spanish class in downtown Chicago. It was started out with 8 people, and that was for introduction one, and that took 4 weeks. And then introduction two, it went down to about 6 people, and then introduction three down to 3 people, and introduction four basically didn't go at all. But the reason I was doing it is we plan to travel to visit some friends in Ecuador, and they speak very limited English, so I wanted to be able to speak at least a representative amount of Spanish.
Okay. Before you took on Spanish, before you were thinking about this, had you ever learned any other languages?
I had taken Italian for a couple semesters at a community college, but basically none during high school, none during college, and then just tried that little bit of Italian beforehand.
Okay. So what was your experience like in that first class? I mean, you've taught for a long time. You know what it's like to walk into a class full of students as a teacher for the first time. What was it like being on the other side of that equation?
Well, it was really pretty scary. I mean, like you said, I'm used to being on the other side, knowing what's going to go on. I'm going to be in control of this. But you walked in there and all you had was your textbook, and you didn't know the teacher, the other people, how they were going to go about it, whether it was going to be a lot of book learning or whether it was going to be more speaking. So, yeah, I was really nervous going into it. And that really has been the biggest thing that I've gotten out of the class is how vulnerable a student is.
Yeah.
Because every class you walk in there and you say, okay, I've studied, I've done my part, but it would take nothing to fall off the horse and be embarrassed in front of everybody. And it's really weird because with my students, I would always say, oh, it's okay. You can make a mistake. That's all right. But I didn't realize how vulnerable you feel in that situation, even when you've been doing your work.
Sure. So what kind of practice do you do then in between classes? Do you just speak a lot of Spanish? I mean, you said that your wife Ann was also taking those classes. Would you practice together, or was it just on your own? How did you approach that?
Well, how it worked out was it basically worked that I would do most of the stuff on my own. And no matter how good our intentions were of let's talk to each other in Spanish, we couldn't pull it off, And so that was really, again, a strange thing. But what I would do is I tried to be the best student possible. I would write things out. I would say things out loud. I would listen to tapes. I would make up my own little dialogues to go along. I would look ahead, so when I went to class, I knew what was going on. And I knew that the way I learned languages very slow. And in fact, everything I learned very slow. But once I get the concept, I'm usually pretty good at it. So what I was trying to do in this class is say, look, you know how you learn. Let's apply this to yourself.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a ton of sense. How much repetition did you build into your practice?
A ton of repetition, and it still wasn't enough. I couldn't believe how much you had to continue to go over the same stuff, especially going from the written portion to the speaking portion.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's where I'm really, I've got a little bit of time before I pick up the next class. And I'm looking for ways to force myself to bridge that gap from I know something on paper, I conceptually know it, but can I hear somebody say it and then understand it? Or can I speak it without having to translate every word?
Yeah, I mean that's fascinating because that sounds so much like what we see with our music students, where they can see it on the paper. Maybe they understand that eighth note and those two sixteenths, how to count it, but then you get something totally different once you put the instrument in front of them. I mean, did you notice any things like that when you were?
Oh, absolutely. And when I've been talking to other people about this process, they said the same thing. They were like, now you know what our beginners go through is they conceptually understand it, but it's like, no, we just talked about B flat 2 minutes ago. What do you mean you can't remember B flat? And the kids are freaking out, you know? So, yeah, I would say one of the biggest things we have to do is continue on the repetition and being able to adjust that repetition to the students. I thought our teacher did an okay job until it came to that. And he really didn't adjust anything. So when he talked very fast, and everybody in class was struggling. And
Hmm.
I understand what he was doing. He didn't want us to always go slow, but he just continued to steamroll over you every time. And so you would get like two words, and all the class would be looking at each other like, "What's going on here?" And he would just keep going. So as teachers, being able to adjust, I think that's a huge thing.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean it's much different when you're on that other side. I want to go back a little bit. You were talking about mistakes. Um, are there any mistakes that you remember from class that really stand out? Like something that just got completely lost in translation, or you missed one word for another, and like now I'm never going to make that mistake again. You have any of those moments you can share?
Oh, absolutely. And it was pointed out at the beginning that if sometimes your best learning comes off mistakes. So there one word quiere means I want to do something, and puede means I'm able to do something. And even to this day, if I really don't think about those two words, I flip flop them. And again, in class, you're sitting there and you do that, and they sort of give you this look like, "What? What are you doing?" And they're like, "Oh, okay." Or oh, there's hundreds of these that come up. There's a personal A. So when you're talking about somebody or your pet or something, you have to put the A in front of there. And man, I miss that thing all the time.
Mm.
And it's just because there are so many rules floating around, and I get through three or four rules, and I think, oh man, I got this thing. And then all of a sudden, it all comes crashing down because I don't think about the personal A, or I don't think about this form of the verb or something like that.
Right, right. I mean, it's, in your native language, all of those rules are just assimilated from so early on that you don't even really think about that. So when you're learning something new, like a new language, you're really having to learn the rules and absorb all of the pronunciation and everything else at the same time. And it can be overwhelming, I would think.
Yeah, it absolutely is. I had talked to Dr. Sai from Vandercook because they speak Mandarin at home, and then her kids go to school and they speak English. And so I had talked to her about this process, and she said, as far as she was concerned, it was all repetition, learning a new language of any kind. Because she says her kids will sit in the car and they will just repeat a word that they don't know over and over, and then they'll try to use it in a sentence, and so on the way home they may use this word 50 times.
Oh, wow.
Where in class I would use it 4 or 5 times instead of just hammering the repetition away. One thing I did was I put into practice the 10-time rule and the 5-time rule. So as I was trying to get a little bit better flow to sentences, I would literally just close my eyes and say that sentence 5 times. And I could really feel the difference. And the first time was definitely, I'm thinking of every word. And
Mm-hmm.
The fifth time, it was like, oh, hey, things are starting to flow along here pretty nicely. And so it's something I transferred from music quite a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I took 4 years of Spanish in high school, and I never really took Italian, but learned enough so that when we went to Italy, that we could kind of get by. And after a while, in the second language, you almost start to think in that language. In fact, I've got one of my colleagues down here at UT who is from Canada and speaks French, and she's constantly having to translate and go back and forth and think in two languages. And she says that she's completely exhausted by the end of the day. Have you had any of that experience where you're starting to think in Spanish, and um, have you experienced that yet?
Yeah, yeah, and but little short clips. And you almost scare yourself when you get to there, where you say, "Wow, that just sort of floated out," and I hope that that was right. But for the most part, it's still chunking along. But yeah, sometimes you get to where you don't have to think in your language.
Yeah. So, uh, one other thing I was thinking about was you've got this trip coming up to Ecuador, so that's really going to be the test of your fluency and your skills. Um,
Right.
do you have anything planned to get you ready for that outside of the class? Some kind of immersive experience.
Yeah, I do, and again, it's making myself be all right with making mistakes and not looking good all the time. So what I have a couple things planned. When we're on our vacation coming up, I'm going to take Rosetta Stone along, so I can do some more hearing of the language and speaking the language. There's also a website called or an app called Happy Talk, which you can get on with anybody who is on at that time that speaks your language will talk to you and tell you what you're saying right and what you're saying wrong.
Oh, that's
Then,
cool.
it's very cool. I've got to check that out here in the next week. And then what I'm going to try to do when I get back is hit all the students that speak Spanish that I know and say, okay, Juan, I'm going to call you at this time every Thursday, and we're just going to talk for 10 minutes. So, can you give me 10 minutes of your time in 1 week? And then I'll call Jose up, and I'll call Julio up, and I'll call Malu up. So, basically, every day I'm going to be talking to somebody in Spanish.
That's a great idea. I mean, that's so much like it's like a mock audition, or
Yeah,
playing your jury for the studio before the juries. If you didn't have
right.
that experience, chances are you get to Ecuador and everything you thought was in there, now it's not quite coming out right. So that's great.
Yeah. And obviously, then after the Ecuador trip, we had talked about going to spending a winter in Spain, 2 months in Spain. And then that will really give you some immersion into the language. Because I just don't think you're ever going to really get it where you want unless you're immersed in there, like the Canadian student said.
Sure,
And
sure.
and yeah, and even like after an hour and a half in this Spanish class, I mean, we're just dead. I mean, we're looking at each other going like, I can't think anymore. So I can only suspect what it's going to be when I have to deal with 8 hours or 10 hours of that. I'm just going to have to go back to the hotel and have some quiet time, I think.
Yeah, yeah. So I know we opened up a little bit. You were talking about some things that you always tell your students. What have been your biggest takeaways from this experience? And I guess my second part of the question is there anything else new on the horizon aside from Spanish that you'd like to learn just from having this experience of doing something new for the first time again?
Oh, well, I'll answer the second part first. Yeah, I have my list of things I want to do, and one of them is to really be able to solo in a jazz style. And I already talked to Tony Kiddinakis about that. And I had every intention of doing it in the fall, But when I saw how much time I was having to spend in Spanish, I didn't want to put two things on the plate. But oh, absolutely, I want to learn improvisation. Uh, I would like to do some composition too, because all my composition has been, well, this sounds good, instead of having any basis behind it. So those are a couple things that I want to do. Don't know from there where, but I'm sure I'll turn up things because for the next X amount of time in my life, I'm going to have a teacher all along. I'm not going to make that same mistake twice. So yeah, this experience has been very good. It's very humbling to get into the classroom and not be in charge. It really puts you in a whole different place. Some other things that stuck out about the class was that the materials that they gave us were not always right.
Mm.
So like they would have questions in the front and answers in the back, and the two wouldn't line up. And I'm going to say maybe it's 5% of the time, but for a student, that's devastating because you're sitting there and you're expecting to get some reinforcement, and now all of a sudden it's like, well, did I completely miss this?
Right.
Or and you don't have any support there, and they just sort of blow it off. Oh, okay, well, yeah, that's wrong. And it's like, well, hold it, really important that those two things are lined up. Because then I can go home, and if I get something wrong, I can sort of look for the answer to it.
Right.
Something else that came up, this was really crazy, was the teacher and I did not really, we just personality-wise weren't on the same track. And I thought many times, how many people in my classes are like that? They're taking my class, and I'll tell a joke, and they'll think, that's the lamest thing I've ever heard. Why,
Mm.
I wish there was another teacher that I could take this from. And it was really one of the few times in my life where I was like, man, I think I sort of want a different teacher. And
Oh,
it wasn't anything that he particularly was or wasn't doing. It was just that we didn't click very well. And when I go back to the next Spanish class, I think I'm going to have another teacher, and I'll see how that goes. But it does bring up the point that wonder if a student doesn't get along with the teacher. How does that affect the whole education part? And I would tell my students when they'd bring this up, I'd say, hey, just suck it up and get the class done. And man, that's hard to do.
yeah.
That's really hard to do because there's such that connection between you and the teacher, and you're looking for them to react to what you do. And if they rub you the wrong way, oh man, that's hard to sit there in class.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
So that came up.
Yeah.
Trying to think of anything else that came up that we talked about the reinforcement from different angles. And again, this class was sort of funny. He basically said, do it however you want to do it, and that was it. He didn't provide any ways to get the job done. It was just whatever. If you want to listen to songs and translate songs, great. If you want to speak to your friends, great. Doesn't matter to me. And
Pretty well.
so from a teacher to say, hey, what about doing this? That kind of thing.
Yeah.
Another thing that came up was the level of commitment and work from the other students. Because like I said, I was working 2 to 3 hours a day by the time I did all my stuff. And then you come into class and the student go, and granted they're working full time, but they say, man, I got nothing done this week. And then you're sitting there like, whoa, I really worked hard on this. You sort of left me in the lurch here.
Yeah, I mean, that really speaks to that whole idea of a learning community and everybody putting forth that effort and kind of pushing each other a little bit, that healthy competition almost. And yeah, when you don't have that, it can make it really, really difficult for a learner.
Especially for the learner who's doing their job.
Yeah.
It really makes it difficult. The one night I remember is that the other two people in class really hadn't gotten anything done, and the guy would come back, and just for some reason or another, when he would say, "Do you know the word for this?" I would know the word for that. And they started sort of getting on my case. They were like, "Wow, what are you doing?" And it brought the whole level of the class down, and I had to stop answering stuff because I was looking like this real pompous guy who, hey, I know everything, and I wasn't trying to come off that way. But I had to sort of back off and say, okay, don't answer the questions too fast. Try to get everybody on the same page. Instead of, if they would have come in with their stuff done, we could have pushed forward.
Wow. I'm wondering how many times that's happened in my classes, and I just hadn't been aware of it.
Yeah. I know. It really has pointed back to my teaching experiences. It's been a very good thing for me to look back on. And for some reason or another, I think I've done a pretty good job without sitting in the student's shoes. I can think back and say, okay, I did this wrong, or wow, I'd like to do that again. But for the most part, I took, and you'd mentioned this before, I try to take a real basic set of information and expand off of that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the way they have this class set up, is here are the 4 basic actions you're going to be working with. Here's a list of verbs. And then through the semester, they put those in different contexts and work around with them. So they're drilling little material over and over and over again. So that's good.
Yeah. Well, Kevin, I think I've asked just about every question I had planned. Is there anything else that we missed?
No, I don't think so. I was sort of looking at my list here. No, I think we pretty well covered it.
Well, great. Well, I hope everything goes well in Ecuador and that you're able to be easily understood and that you can find your way around. I'm sure you'll get it figured out.
Oh, we'll get it figured out. When you travel, people make the effort to speak English, and you can do a lot by just a couple nouns here and there.
Yeah. Maybe we'll do a follow-up all in Spanish.
Okay, yeah. Too soon. After Ecuador, then let's do that.
Well, sounds good. Well, thanks, Kevin. I really appreciate you spending some time here with me and talking about your learning experiences.
Okay, great, buddy. You have a good day.
All right, you too.